Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Inawi, Marketing Manager for Egypt, Europe for the American University in Cairo Press. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual book discussion of Women in Ancient Egypt, Revisiting Power, Agency, and Autonomy, edited by Mariam Ayad. Today's event will be around an hour, and we're going to have room for Q&A at the end of the session. So please, if you have questions, type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And for those joining us on Facebook, you can type in your questions in the comment section. I'm going to send it to our panelists. So, Women in Ancient Egypt. This is a volume of cutting-edge research by 24 international scholars on female power, agency, health, and literacy in ancient Egypt. And today's panelists are all based in different countries across the globe. So it's a true international book discussion. So let me first start by introducing our panelists. Mariam Ayad, say hi, Mariam. She's the book editor, and she is the Associate Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo. And in 2020 to 2021, she was a visiting Associate Professor of Women's Studies and Near Eastern Religions and a Research Associate of the Women's Studies in Religion program at Harvard Divinity School. She studied Egyptology at AUC for her bachelor degree and for her MA in University of Toronto, and she got her PhD in Brown University. And she was a tenured Associate Professor of Art History and Egyptology at the University of Memphis, Tennessee, before returning to Egypt in 2011. She's also the author of God's Wife, God's Servant, the God's Wife of Amun, and she's the editor of 3 volumes on Coptic culture. Our second panelist is Anne Austin. Hi, Anne. She received her BA in Anthropology from Harvard University and her MA and PhD in the Archaeology program at UCLA before starting her position as an assistant professor at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And she completed a 3-year postdoctoral program at the History Department at Stanford University. Her research combines the fields of osteology and Egyptology in order to document medicine and disease in the past. Specifically, she uses data from ancient Egypt human remains and daily life texts to reconstruct ancient Egyptian healthcare networks and identify the diseases and illnesses people experienced in the past. Her current research project explores how the practice of tattooing in ancient Egypt connects to gender, religion, and medicine. Our third panelist, Kathrin Gabler, I hope I pronounced correctly, is an Egyptologist who specializes in the New Kingdom late Bronze Age period, hieratic texts, and the ancient workers' village of Deir el-Medina, which is the background she has right now. Her research interest ranges from social and economic history to prosopography to material studies and object biographies. Kathrin is currently an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, where she is substituting for Frederick Hagen and Kim Rylott. She's also conducting a large-scale reinvestigation of tomb TT-217 in Deir el-Medina and developing a cutting-edge research platform at the University of Basel in cooperation with the French Institute for Oriental Archaeology in Cairo. Our fourth panelist, Susan Kelly, or Sue, she's an early career researcher who completed her first postdoc fellowship at Macquarie University in 2022. She is in the final stages of preparing her manuscript, Lifting the Veil, Female Social Power in Early Egypt, which is an extension of her PhD, Female Engagement in Domains of Social Power in Ancient Egypt's Dynasties 1 to 6. Sue advances a theoretical study of ancient biographical inscriptions that offers new perspectives into women's involvement, influence, and impact in the state's socioeconomic structure in early Egypt. This work incorporated her master's research and identified and analyzed women of early dynastic Egypt from women's funerary teal slabs from Abu Rawash, Hilwan, and Abydos. She's passionate about raising women's profile in ancient history by challenging the androcentric narratives of previous scholarship and integrating theoretical perspectives. Please join me in welcome our wonderful panelists, and thank you so much for taking time of your day or evening to do this discussion. And now over to Mariam.
Suzanne, thank you so much for this introduction and for organizing this event, and for all the attendees. Thank you all for your interest in our work, and for the panelists, especially Sue, thank you for waking up at this early hour. It's 4 a.m. in Australia to join us, but also thank you to Kathrin and Anne for joining us in the midst of very busy work days. So the way this is going to be set up, because I'm a very visual person, I'm going to share with you some of my slides, and also why I wanted to edit this volume, which stemmed from an international conference organized at AUC in fall of 2019. And then I'm going to ask our panelists to each speak a little bit about their work and why they do what they do. And then we'll circle back to a discussion of how is what we're doing different from what's published, and what prompted us to look at sometimes evidence that's been around for 100 years or more with fresh eyes. So my own chapter in this volume is titled Moving Beyond Gender Bias, because as I was teaching a class regularly on women in ancient Egypt at AUC, I kept coming across the problem of not having a book that would adequately address everything that the students of this day and age wanted to learn about, like literacy or women's employment beyond the couple of lines that are found in the more general books. So sometimes I would give them articles to read, and if they're freshmen, they might be intimidated by the number of bibliographic entries on my syllabus, even if the page numbers are not drastically huge. And then there was my thought, sorry, this is just a sampling of the number of books available out there, specialized great studies on Nefertiti and Hatshepsut and Old Kingdom queens and Cleopatra, but also more general books about women in general. And that's a brief sampling of some of the books available in the English language that have been published recently. So I think a good question to ask is, what more are we offering, and what more do we have to say in this new volume on women in ancient Egypt? I think it's common knowledge now that for those who are interested in women in ancient Egypt, that women in ancient Egypt enjoyed a lot of rights, unparalleled definitely in the ancient world, but also unparalleled in some cultures today. They could initiate divorce, they could testify in court, they could inherit and dispose of property, something that Greek women were not able to do, since Greek women were themselves the property of their husbands or fathers. And women in ancient Egypt could work outside the home. So part of my frustration with the published scholarship was the assumption that whenever a woman had a title that implied work outside the home, especially in the temple, that title would be considered honorific and not necessarily income generating, even though we have evidence from Abu Sir papyri and otherwise of female ritualists earning an income or partaking in the temple offerings, just like the male ritualists were. The other point of frustration was whenever I had to teach my students about Hatshepsut, there's one of two things that always came up. One, she's a usurper doing something that should not have been done. Her name and titles were erased after her decease because they resented having a woman as a king. Or, you know, the most glaring, which I didn't include today, but for those of you who were in my presentation 2 weeks ago, the alleged relationship with Senenut. Because of course, there has to be a man behind the scenes pulling all the strings. It could not possibly have been her. Well, I'm happy to report that one of the things that our book offers is a fresh look at Hatshepsut and Nefertiti by Jacqueline Williamson, where she argues that Hatshepsut actually fulfilled a proper ideological role in a time when there was a vacuum in the power structure. And as such, she did not really act against the establishment as many respected scholars would have us believe, but rather she just saved the day and rose up to the occasion. So this is one fresh look at Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, two of the most common and iconic figures from ancient Egypt, and yet there is still more to say about them if we just step back and look at the evidence with fresh eyes. Another contribution in the volume talks about a specific goddess, Amunet, and how she features very prominently in the decorative program in Hatshepsut's temple. Hatshepsut has long been recognized as someone who's really innovative in the realm of religious practice and all the festivals that she sponsored in the Theban region. And her active promotion of cults, of female cults especially, cults of female deities such as Mut has been well established since the early 80s. But yet there is still more to be said in that regard based on new iconographic field research by Kapik and her team at Deir Bahari. And of course, I cannot not talk about the gods' wives, who were, as far as we know, single women of royal descent, princesses of Libyan, Nubian, and Sayyid origin, who performed rituals that up to that point were the prerogative of the king only, including the ultimate ritual, which is offering ma'at to the gods, who would then embrace them, suckle them, crown them, do all kinds of great things to them, to the extent that the last such woman who held the office of God's wife was officially the high priest of Amen, and the titles were perfectly feminized to suit her gender. To the extent that she also acquired an official name or throne name that included the element Heka, or ruler, and on her sarcophagus now in the British Museum, she is indeed shown with the scepter and the crook and the flail. Again, royal scepters and royal emblems that I would shy away from saying that she's an actual king, but she felt empowered enough to appropriate these kingly insignia repeatedly, in addition to all of them acquiring an official name that they enclosed in a cartouche like a king would. And yet, as recently as 2004, one of my former professors, whom I deeply respect, in his book on the Black experience in ancient Egypt, would not concede that these women were really powerful, and instead called the court more of a theme park than city hall. Now that really pained me to read, because you think in the 2000s people would have moved beyond this lens of no, a woman would never ever be powerful. And also a theme park is infantilizing. Who goes to theme parks? They're playing Barbie in a big dollhouse, perhaps. It was just as one remark in the one book that's otherwise very good, but it's still really peeved me to read that and irked me. And of course, someone who's very well known to Sue Kelly, Nebet, who is one of several female viziers of the Old Kingdom, and yet regularly in books on Egyptian history of that period, she would not be named. Two of her daughters married King Pepi, and her husband is named Hui in Ian Shaw's History of Ancient Egypt, for example, but she's not named. And when people consider her title, they considered it in isolation of the other instances of female viziers, which have indeed come to my attention only last week or 2 weeks ago by one of our contributors. So they treated the anomalous title as fictitious, claiming one time that it was granted to her after her death, claiming another time that she had a very unique power sharing position with her husband, who actually did the duties of a vizier, but she held the title herself. Or, the very glaring exclusion of her from any discussion. Kanawati, about 10, 15 years ago, suggested that maybe she was a member of the royal family of the late 5th dynasty, and as such, the daughters would be marrying their cousin or something. fine, but to ignore her completely and to ignore her titles was something that didn't sit well with me. And that all that frustration and simmering anger gave rise to the conference held at AUC in the fall of 2019. And of course, when her titles and inscriptions are cited, people draw a parallel to a 26th dynasty statue, and they give you the catalog general number, but they don't ever mention that it's actually the statue of Ankhana Nefer Ibra, who herself was a very powerful woman. And then one of my recent research foci has been female literacy in ancient Egypt. And again, the evidence from the Old Kingdom, from the tomb of Edut, shown here in the red box, of a scribal palat and a scribal kit has been dismissed. Why? Because this is a tomb that was originally decorated for a male official. So it was suggested that this was a leftover from a previous owner decorative scheme. And of course, no, a woman could not possibly possess these prized items. And lo and behold, at our conference, Roman that Bays in her talk on ostentation Old Kingdom female tombs, based on her doctoral dissertation out of the Sorbonne, documented very clearly that when women appropriated tombs made for men, every scene that was not appropriate for women for inclusion would be altered. And she documented that by going at the wall and checking all the chisel marks. The fact that Edut's scribal desk and scribal palat were left there and not altered indicate to me that it was acceptable for a woman to own these items and possibly, very possibly also use them. But where is that in recent scholarship? I mean, people skirt away and shy away from disagreeing really with respected scholars who otherwise are great people, but sometimes when the rights are not given to women in your own culture, it's hard to see it in other cultures as well. So it's not an intentional bias necessarily. And as far go as the late 80s, Fisher documented instances of women possibly sponsoring the burials of their sons, who were occasionally in the employ of the king, like Werka, seen here in the middle scene. But where exactly did these women gain their economic means? People again stopped shy of discussing that until, of course, Sue Kelly came along and discussed the role of women in the economic domain for her dissertation. But then she was kind enough to submit an abstract for the conference and then a contribution to the volume, where she dissects the different ways women were employed in the public domain that may have generated income. But more than income, it's really about also power and agency over decisions, for bodily decisions, relationship decisions, and dispensation of wealth decisions. So again, from Fisher, I mean, that's almost 35 years ago that was published. He documented very carefully instances where women were in the employ of other women. Do you really expect that all these women worked for free? That they never generated an income from their work outside the home? I personally find that very hard to believe. And this female doctor, who even has a TED documentary about her, animated short of 5 minutes, has also been dismissed as, of course, a woman could not be a doctor, let alone overseer of doctors, even though the titles are right there. So people have tried to say, well, maybe it's the title of some of her male relatives. But what really frustrated me is that any kind of explanation was considered acceptable and a sign of someone's ability to critically think, except the obvious. Whereas with male titles, we tend as scholars, as Egyptologists, to take them at face value, but not so for women. Including the instance from the New Kingdom, but although there is precedent in the Middle Kingdom as well, of women serving on the Kenbet or the city council of the Medina. Could they read or not? is not something that we can tell, but definitely their judgment was considered solid enough, and they were considered to have enough common sense to decide on village matters, I think. Otherwise, why put them there? And it's not one, but two women that served in that capacity. In fact, Del Medina yields a whole lot of texts written or addressed to women by women. And again, the common wisdom is that they employed a scribe of some sort. But when you read the texts themselves, they're often very brief notes, sometimes talking about private matters, sometimes the language is quite simple. So I wouldn't automatically exclude the possibility of women being literate just because we don't expect them to. So that's basically what prompted me to organize the conference and edit the volume. And I was so very pleased with the number of abstracts we received. More than 60 abstracts were submitted for that conference. Eventually, about 40 people came as presenters and presented posters, and of those, 24 are included in the volume. So I am very proud of the volume. I'm very proud of all the participants. And with that, maybe Sue can tell us a little bit about her work, and then Kathrin also on the Medina.
Thanks, Mariam, and you've done a wonderful job of trying to encapsulate, not only the book, but what the conference and exactly what our discipline is trying to achieve by raising this platform on women. You very interestingly pointed out a couple of the things in regards to Nebet and this whole mindset that, women really weren't doing things. It's honorific. And this is something that I'm really focused on in regards to my work in the economic domain, as well as more broadly. It's this perception that, they couldn't be literate, they must have a scribe. And this is why I really try to focus on the inscriptions to bring out the stories of the women that I study, and looking at, not only the inscriptions, but what they're saying. We're looking at where you've got Nebet, it's honorific. We're looking at Peshet, who is a doctor, but of course, in Fisher's wonderful volume, he says, she was a doctor of female. She's an overseer of female doctors. So again, it's always encased. Our knowledge has so far been encased with these previous perceptions, which is why I really tried to break down those walls and allow to illuminate what the women were actually doing without the Western or colonial gendered mindset that's been laid onto it. And I think it's equally important to consider all the women, the millers who are, doing the grain, and all the way to the overseers who are, running the weaving and the textile workshops, so it's very much about trying to uncover not just royal and high elite women, but really trying to break down into those lower levels so we can get a better understanding of the economic structure of the state and women's position in there. I also really find that the idea of literacy, William Ward in his wonderful work said there were no female overseers of any trade. Well, we have the records now to show that there really are. And as I think, Mariam, you've pointed out, even in the book, surely, if they're an overseer, they're also having the ability to write, to actually be able to, fulfill their duties. They need these skills. But as you said, we always keep coming up against this wall that, women, were only employed by other women. They aren't literate. They don't participate equally to a male level, which I think, there is no way of doing comparable studies with men and women when the data sets are just totally, unequal. What we need to do is really just try to focus and show what women were doing within their own context and within the broader context. And that's quite difficult sometimes. We've been affected like anybody, that our actual corpus or everything we're working on is very restricted to what's only survived. So we're only having part of a story instead of the full picture. So what we really need to focus on is making sure that we illuminate those things within an ancient Egyptian context and not into the other. So I really find that, you know, once we look at that, I showed in the chapter and, you know, and our wonderful conference, when we start looking at the numbers, and I try to fortify my research with collecting a lot of data so we can actually see how many women are doing what. And we can also see how many women who didn't get any engagement titles. So I think, you know, it's very much about having a framework, you know, bolstered by sociological theory that we can frame our work into, and then using the inscriptions that have survived, biographical data of these women, to bring them forward.
Thank you very much, Sue. Kathrin, would you like to share some of your work on Deir Medina and the women of Deir Medina? And, you know, as Susan Kanawi said at the beginning, Anne Austin also works on Deir Medina and on women, but from a different angle, their actual bodies. So once we hear about their economies of Deir Medina, we'll also hear about their bodies from Anne.
And that's exactly the nice thing, of course, about this unique site. We are now in the case to use a lot of material from a unique place in the New Kingdom in the late Bronze Age, and a unique site in settlement archaeology in the entire Near East in the late Bronze Age. And there is a lot of documentation about these females living in the village. But when you look at the headline already at my chapter, even our terminology a little bit neglects these women. Of course, a term very well established in the 1970s by the still very important book of Jaroslav Czerny calls it the community of workmen, leaving aside that there are many women and also other children, retired men, supply staff, etc., part of this community. And without those other parts, this community would not have lived for 250 years of the Ramesside period to build the incredible tombs in the Valley of the Kings and Queens. So I think we also have to reflect a little bit in the phrasing we are using, and reflecting which kind of terminology we use. So that's my first approach in the chapter, to change it to the community of workers, because the community of workers also includes all the female inhabitants, which were apparently also the ones using the village the most during the work week, when most of the males were apart for working duties in the valleys. So step one, using different vocabulary, but step two is also using the entire potential of the site. Of course, this site was explored for many, many years, and there are separate volumes, as you have seen before at Mariam's slide, with the recent works, but we are usually drawing on the same examples. So of course, famous and unique documents like the Villa of Naonachti, probably every one of us using in classes and teaching, of course, an important document. But there are many more stories to tell about these females in the settlement, but you have to dive a little bit closer, and you need to access the material. And that's, of course, a complex endeavor in this settlement, because we are kind of overwhelmed with the material. So managing the entire textual and material evidence is such a great challenge that some of us just focus on a particular group. So my personal research now focused on first publishing primary sources. So for example, Chile, but also papyri, dealing a little bit more with the female literacy in the village. But besides publishing the primary sources, it's also important to combine all of this evidence. And this is too much for a single researcher. So this is a kind of a modern research community, which consists also of both genders, so male and female, as it was in the village. So one of my projects right now is to continue with the research on the females, is actually publishing, but also combining. And by combining, you need to use new technologies. And this is why I've started this new research-based Medina project to include this evidence and to combine it to the most effect using different methods and tools to get an overview and to figure out what were these women about. So you can reconstruct entire life cycles from their birth, childhood, but also when they get married, that how many children did they have, what happened in the afterlife, how did they prepare for being buried, ending up with the human remains we actually have on this site. So this is a unique chance to do, but we also have to use this potential somehow and achieve then a new and fresh view on Deir el-Medina. And the good news is for my side that I'm of course here as a prosopographic evidence and more textual material culture, but also N is part of Mission Deir el-Medina, and she can talk a little bit more about the human remains and the mummified female we have.
Perfect, thank you. So yes, I have been the lead bioarchaeologist on our site at Deir el-Medina for a decade, and like we've just heard, we have so much documentation from this site. We are so honored to be able to work at a place like this. But one of the issues with our documentation is it is very biased because it's focused often on administrative matters that really focus on the men in the village. And my work on the human remains doesn't have those same biases. So, when people are buried on site, whether men, women, elderly, disabled, children, their human remains can teach us a lot about what's happening at this site that would be a little bit harder to access just one direction alone. So the opportunities at Deir el-Medina for understanding what women's experiences were like are so amazing because we can bring in so many diverse angles to look at it. In terms of my contribution for the volume, one of the things that we've come to discover through the work on the human remains for the past few years that was quite unexpected was the presence of tattooing at Deir el-Medina. And the first evidence we found was a woman who was very heavily tattooed. She had at least 30 tattoos placed on her arms, her neck, her lower back. And through looking at these tattoos, we started to see a sign of her deep connections with the goddess Hathor, with these divine symbols that were permanently placed in these very visible parts of her body. And as I did more and more research on the practice of tattooing, there's a couple things about this that really struck me as unexpected from what we had from previous research. And the first is that we don't tend to find women having these priestess titles of Hathor during the New Kingdom during this time. We see a big disparity in the titles we see with some of the titles that Sue is presenting and what we find in the New Kingdom. And people have said in the past, perhaps this is because women's bodies were seen as too impure to be able to be priestesses during this time. And yet simultaneously, their bodies are permanently and publicly displaying this deep association with this goddess, even having divine eyes of a goddess placed on all sides of her body. So any way you look at this woman, a pair of divine eyes are looking back at you. And so from that, one of the angles is just to say that maybe the role of women in religion isn't showing up in our traditional places like titles, but is actually showing up in other places that we have not looked. And then the other side of things is looking at the broader research on the practice of tattooing, which does tend to be quite gendered. So we have evidence of tattooing in Egypt from the pre-dynastic moving forward, but our evidence comes in kind of small bits and pieces. We don't have a huge amount of evidence. And the vast majority of evidence we have, whether in figurines or on human remains, it's predominantly found in women. So when I looked to the very earliest evidence that's been published about tattooing in women, what we've seen is that the vast majority of very early scholars immediately suggested that these women were wearing tattoos to entertain a male gaze, to entertain the king, a tomb owner, that these were signs of that they were sex workers, that they were poor or serving classes. And all of these ideas around what tattooing meant, why women were tattooed, why it was a gendered practice, were much more focused actually on what was happening in America and in Europe with tattooing during the 19th and 20th century, and far less focused on the limited evidence we had from Egypt. So the very first mummified remains with tattoos that we'd found came from a very high elite context in the Middle Kingdom, and yet these were some of the notions that were coming out. So my chapter looks at these perceptions, these early perceptions of tattooed women, and then brings in some of the new evidence, which even though our data set is small at Dar el-Medina, we now have more and more evidence coming up. And as we get that, our ideas are changing. So I look at some of the ways that I see these tattoos functioning, particularly the ones that have their religious symbolism placed on the body, and how that might actually extend women's roles beyond this very simple eroticization.
Great, thank you, Anne. And I have to share how I hounded you repeatedly to include a contribution by you in this volume, because Anne was not one of the original participants at the conference, but I was at a different conference about 10 days later, literally, and I was just so taken aback by her work, amazing work. So thank you for including your work in this volume. So it's not just the participants, but also other people working on women, which leads to our maybe last round of remarks about why do you all think that material has been neglected thus far, even though some of it has been known for centuries, literally 2 centuries or 150 years or 100 years or 50 years. And with Dar el-Medina especially, you know, the work that's come out of there because of the amount of texts and how it's been preserved and abandoned and all that is tremendous. And like 15 years ago, people would tell you, oh, it's been done. There's nothing more to be done there in many ways, right? Because it's a lot of it presumably has been published, but there's apparently more that hasn't been, right? So could you all speak to that, and also Sue for the Old Kingdom?
I really wanted to link what you were saying there in regards to why we're needing to look at it after centuries of the evidence being there. And this is something that's always, you know, really quite relevant. And I think that's because, you know, the political and cultural environment, you know, 150 years ago, it's totally different to the environment we are now. And of course, that shapes the way anybody actually looks at the world and how we look at research, you know. So obviously when the information was coming out from the early dynastic royal cemetery, and also a lot of the work done in the early to the middle of the 20th century was done and completed by mainly men with a totally different political and cultural environment that were just not really that aware of women. A lot of women around the world didn't even get the right to vote into the 1960s. So I think it's very indicative of the time and how now that gender and women is becoming so much more an important aspect of our political and cultural time, that, you know, we're raising this up and we're actually seeing that. And I noticed, Anne, in your chapter, you know, a lot of, which I thought was amazing, by the way, was all about that similar thing, that bias of, you know, that earlier connotations of women being tattooed as being deviant and things like that. So I think, you know, there's a common thread here where we can actually see that women need to be revisited because the stories that were originally recorded are just inaccurate. Would you agree, Anne, in regards to what you found with that previous scholarship on the tattooed women?
Yeah, and I think that comment really ties in nicely with a question we have in the Q&A as well from Elaine Sullivan, who asks, how can we as a field rid ourselves finally of this antiquated language and terminology, which continues to color our scholarship and then is picked up by the public? So thinking of tattooing as having to do with sex work, using, you know, thinking of them as prostitutes or courtesans, and these terminologies, which I'll say came in to the picture in our early 20th century scholarship, but continues to be in the picture with publications for the past 10 years. So this is not something that has, I mean, when I first started working on the chapter, I felt like I had to write this chapter because it is still here. It is not going anywhere. So I think it's this work, right? Volumes like this are what we need. And it goes back to Mariam's question at the beginning of, why do we have this book? We have many books on women in ancient Egypt. Why do we need this book? And we need this book because we need the space in each of our chapters to really dive into those problems, to dive into those histories, to explain the arc of our field, and to start to help eradicate those things. I really needed a whole chapter to say, let's get rid of this myth that tattooed women had to be sex workers, when we don't have any evidence that made that connection. And I feel really grateful that I had this opportunity, because it's something that in this volume makes perfect sense.
Yeah, dragging up on some of the questions also. So coming to which new things, or another look at objects. So some of the objects, especially in Dar Medina, are mainly published also only in facsimiles or drawings. So sometimes it's the first time for over 40, 50, 60 years that we see the original artifacts stored on sites in magazines or in storage spaces all over the world in magazines. And of course, a look at an object changes sometimes the already interpreted part of a previous researcher, maybe 100 or 50 years ago, when just publishing then later on translation or a drawing or so already an interpretation. So many of these details matter in these regards. For another and fresh look. And even in a tomb, for example, when I now work in TD217, there are many human remains also stored, which requires then first proper investigation, which is also done with Zen, where we again link together. So there is a lot to be done still on the publication and on the rediscovery of the objects. And when looking at these bodies, for example, there is yet another example and a new one for tattoos, for example. So yes, it's worth having first new conclusions, new results, but also sometimes when rediscovering then the same object over and over. The question for the literacy part, that's I think one of the most difficult to answer, to be honest. Now coming, of course, from Dar Medina and the textual evidence, I cannot provide a number. This is simply not possible. That's highly statistical, so we have to calculate how many people lived there, and then we have to somehow, for an average for a certain specific time, and we also have to calculate how many different people could we probably identify in writing. And then we end up in a matter with paleography. So it's unfortunately not as easy than just looking at who wrote a letter to whom, because most of these letters show the same handwriting, but different senders and addresses. So the matter is highly complex. So I don't want to come up with a number here. When now rechecking all the letters written by women to women, or just from a woman to a man, it's very difficult for me to say for sure we have a female writer just based on the paleography. I have one case where I cannot exclude it, but it's very difficult to prove. So that's a matter of ongoing details, especially in the field of paleography.
So I want to address that a little bit, because the 5% number is based off of the Veins and Air article looking at Old Kingdom evidence. And there they actually suggest a very tentative 3%. When the article was republished, it first appeared in 1983, but when it was republished by Baines in 2007, he did include a small paragraph explaining their criteria. And basically they were looking at professional scribes, people who earn their living through their writing, not just the ability to read and write. People who do research on literacy outside of the ancient world, like for the UN, etc., they emphasize the fact that reading and writing are two different skills, even though they are related, and that there are different degrees of competencies for both reading and writing. So when we discuss literacy in general, we do have to apply a more nuanced approach to the material and ask more complex questions, not just who could read and write, but at what level. Right? Could they only sign their name? Would that make them literate? Could they read but not write? Especially that hieroglyphs and hieratic are a bit more sophisticated, right? And the analogy for modern Arabic is the same, like the different scripts, between typed and handwritten as well. Elizabeth MacDonald asks a question of all of us of how do we get word of these new ways of looking at the information out to the general public? I think the forum here is one way, but what other ways may you be able to think of or suggest?
I mean, we all are very active at different social media and public channels, for example. So for Del Medina, you can access different ways with the outreach. And for example, we just had a series of YouTube video clips online about the specific work ongoing in different subprojects. So it's worth a visit. That's open access for everyone to get.
And I also, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, for people who are interested in engaging with some known scholars and budding researchers like myself, we do have on Facebook a Women and Gender in Ancient Egypt Facebook group, where, you know, people come on, we share some interesting stories, highlights on the different scholars, you know, mothers of Egyptology. So there's another way that you can actually engage and keep up to date. We're revamping what content we're doing at the moment. So that might be another way to engage and keep an eye and a finger on the pulse of what's coming up. Sorry, Anne.
No, I was just going to also add that one thing about Egypt that's great is people love sharing news about Egypt. So with the work that I've done on tattooing, that gets a lot of news coverage because people are excited. Tattooed Egyptian mummies instantly is something that people feel like sharing. The caveat, though, is that these same issues that we're talking about in our scholarship happens in the news. So I don't get to have final say on what a lot of these news articles publish. And recently there was a spate of news about the work. And of course, in like the Daily Mail or some more tabloid oriented publication, they said, oh, tattooed tramp stamps, right? Like that was the headline. So I think even when we engage with the public, or especially when we try to engage with a much more public audience that has much less background, we have to be careful because some of these same issues can just be repeated.
Definitely. So two questions that are related somehow. One is about a phrase in ancient Egyptian that instructs females to obey their husbands. And if ancient Egypt was gender equal society, why are there such phrases? And then a question from one of our own students here at AUC, Nandra Zaki, about whether Egyptian society itself was more male dominated than female dominated. So she wonders whether it's not just a matter of modern scholarship, but rather whether the fault lies in the ancient Egyptian culture itself. And how would you discuss it or address this in the book? Regarding the phrase about obeying, if I may interject, and Kathrin, you can follow up if you like, is the word to obey is to listen, sajam. And sajam is just like in colloquial Egyptian Arabic, yisma kalam, hear words, sajam medu, actually is a direct translation. So young people are urged to listen to old people, to instruction in general. I don't recall that there is something specific to women where they're asked to listen to their husbands, but everyone is requested to listen carefully before speaking up, like the young official, for example, in Tahotep. And there is numerous instructions about how it's better to listen than to talk, and chatterboxes are not good, etc. In the context of equipping a young official to become successful in a professional career. But also a judge is called Sajimu, one who listens, right? So there are all these concepts about listening that is not necessarily to obey, because there isn't a separate verb to obey. And yeah, I'm leaving Nandra's question to the other panelists about whether Egyptian culture itself was patriarchal.
I think it's very interesting topic because, you know, we've got to remember that most of the record keeping in ancient Egypt, was done by males. male scribes, artists, depicting, what in the tombs, what they call daily life scenes, which were more pragmatic than actually, a family photograph being put up on the wall. So obviously, what has survived has come from a very male-dominated viewpoint, which a lot of people would automatically assume, yes, that means it's a patriarchal society. But can we actually determine that? I think that'd be a wonderful PhD for some, up-and-coming student to look at, definitely beyond my scope. But I just think that, a lot of the archaeological praxis back in, the late 19th and early 20th century, it was focused on men. That viewpoint sometimes missed the marginalized sections of society. We've only got that real top-down approach. So we're not seeing, the farmers, we're not seeing the everyday people because they didn't have written records. So maybe, there's a lot of scope there that we need to kind of broaden our view away from that top-down and textual approach to try and understand a society if it is or isn't really patriarchal.
Just go on. No, so just a little later on. So I would certainly not call it a fault of the ancient Egyptian society, because keep in mind we have quite many rights for women in ancient Egypt compared then to the later stages of classical Greek, Roman, etc. Periods. So I would definitely not say it's a fault of a male-dominated society. So I think we are kind of advanced, but it's also what is preserved, who is able to leave something behind and to investigate. And even when I have now an extraordinary evidence of females from Dar Medina, I still have to investigate the men, because if I'd like to date a woman, I also have to investigate her husband, her children, all the other members of the household. And of course, a tomb being cut by mainly men. So I cannot distinguish that from each other. So if I want to look at the women, I also have to look at the men at the same time.
Going back to the question about, is it a patriarchal society? I think when we talk about patriarchy, we often are using it as a way to talk about power, about who has power, about can women have power, or when do women have power? And I think if we focus on that, then we can tweak it from yes, no, it is or isn't patriarchal, to where do we have evidence that women have power, and is it because they're just a person and we aren't just thinking about the world through the lens of gender? Is it because they're a woman? What's happening? Is it because they're wealthy? So for instance, in the work that we're doing at Dar el Medina, we have women who have extreme amounts of power, like the examples we've seen already in the presentation. And it's those women have, and this goes to one of the questions Jungmin Lee asks, did female commoners perform an important role in domestic cults? How do they do that? How do you think they performed an important role of transferring elites' religious knowledge and dogma to commoners? Now, this is not a site of commoners. This is a site of people who are relatively elite. But in this context, where we have a lot of evidence, we can say that women are having important cultic roles through the tattooing, through some of the other evidence we get from the site, through some of the titles that we do get. We have women who act as chantresses or women who act as performers, and those performances are part of the religious cult. We also have a wise woman whose name really is Rahet. It's the wise woman, and people within the village go to her and ask her to basically check in with the divine, to explain to them some of the things that they can't explain themselves. And so she's acting as a divine intermediary for some of the people who are very literate in the village, and likely would have, men who likely, if it's about power, she has some kind of power of the divine that they don't, and they have to go to her for it. So I think that's a helpful way for me to frame that idea around patriarchy. And going into religious practice, it means that women have a power in religious practice, but it's, again, not one we're necessarily seeing through maybe these professional titles. It's a different way that we're seeing evidence for it.
And the example Anne just used is actually a very good one for the wise woman, because this wise woman is only attested in letters So we never have her name. We never know where exactly she was based. So, and the letters are again mainly male scribes addressing male questions, and the wise woman is mentioned within these letters. So I cannot deal now with the wise woman, disregarding the fact that she is mentioned in communication between two men, and especially aspects about children dying in early age.
Maybe because she had too much power. So she who shall not be named, otherwise.
But I think it's also in regards to the different forms of power. You know, history's been told, you know, with Weber and all the rest, you know, this power over, and that's the predominant way power is considered. You know, the domains of social power, power with, power to, power in despite of. There's so many different. Abazadeh has done a great job of just showing the different ways power modalities can be informed in a society and by whom. So I think that's another layer we need to kind of add to our research models, is to understand power in different modalities.
And speaking of power, economic power definitely is something that has not been worked on enough. So the question is whether we can elaborate on these mothers involved in burials of their sons. Not really, because we don't really know that they actually paid for these burials. We just assume that they may have, because in the example in the center of the screen here, the figure 4, it is the mother who actually utters the threat formula, who protects the tomb against anyone who shall do anything bad about it. In the one to our left, the woman occupies the position of primacy. And she's slightly bigger, but she's also orientated toward the right. And in the third, number 6, the man is identified as the son of this woman, Khanet. So the prominence given to the women here led Fisher to suggest that maybe they were somehow involved in establishing the funerary cult of their sons, but we don't have documentation for that. In fact, we don't really have documentation for who exactly paid for what. What we do have are general statements about how the king himself granted the tomb owner, especially in the Old Kingdom, the right to use fine limestone from Torah, or the finest quality for the sarcophagus. So it's, again, any statement that's made is to show the proximity to the royal family and to the king in particular. And a question for Kathrin: are you using social network analysis to study the women in Medina?
I just saw that. Hey, Nikki. Actually, I think we are not there. We still have to do a lot of homework in the Medina data management and the data sets. As discussed earlier by Sue, we have to come up with more standardized systems for titles, people's names, etc., etc. So I think first we have to do our homework until we can use a technology, a theory, and software like social network analysis, because we don't have the full frame. If you use the current databases, it's either just focusing on the administrative side or only on the tombs, and the women are depending on the period. Some are only in the 19th dynasty, then you are in the tombs. If you look at the administrative side, they are only in the 20th dynasty material. So I think first you have to get the material together. Otherwise, you have a very unbalanced picture of the material for women from which period, and that also leads to a completely different thing. So for now, no, and I'm also not convinced if this is the right way forward for Del Medina because of the complexity and the heterogeneous data we have.
Yeah, thank you for that. And finally, maybe one last question, because our time is up almost. Has there been any new discoveries since the book has been published, which is technically 4 months ago? Well, of course, it's been in the process for a while, editorial process and production for a while. But any new discoveries, say, in the past 2 years that you'd like to share with the people here?
Personally, for me, what I just discussed before, so that I reinvestigated all the letters and returned to the question of literacy in the village, which is for me my personal nightmare right now, because I cannot really get you one example at least of a female scribe. My hope was very high in this regards, but I have not given up. So this is still in the process. The first article will be out in the frame of a conference about diplomacy, women and diplomacy in the late Bronze Age, edited by Mariam Ayad. So forthcoming, hopefully end of the year or next year with the first results.
I published in around the same time an article with some new evidence of tattooing that we combined. So I published with our other colleague at Darul Medina, Mary-Lisa Arnett from Johns Hopkins, evidence of tattooing in human remains and then in hand-modeled figurines, where we also see markings that we were exploring whether those were tattoos or not, and if so, what do they tell us? What kinds of connections can we make between these bodies that are in clay and these human bodies? So I'll put a link to that in our chat if you're interested in checking out. It was through the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology and just came out in 2022, and it's titled Of Ink and Clay.
Super. Maybe one more quick question from Jongmin Lee. She's asking about whether not all females enjoyed the same rights and whether commoners were totally restricted to religious activities. My take on that is that we often fall into the trap of treating women as a monolithic group when they were as varied as we are today by class, by time period, by geography, whether they're urban or in the countryside. So I shy away from all these generalized statements, but it was very much about class in ancient Egypt as it is in modern society. So if you were a woman of means back then, you had more rights and more freedoms and owned more property than if you were a peasant woman who basically had to live from one meal to the other, subsistence, right? Very similar to today when, wealth is a big factor in how free some women can be more than other women. So that's something that we really have to be cognizant of when we study women in ancient societies in general, that they were as varied as we are today. And I would say, no, commoners were not restricted to religious activities at all. In fact, they were often in the marketplace selling fish and vegetables and fruits and bread and all kinds of things as well.
So I guess we're not gonna take more questions. I think we're already around an hour. I just want to take this chance to thank you all for your time, Mariam, Sue, Anne, and Kathrin. It was a definitely interesting talk, and I'm sure our audiences also enjoyed it as much as I did. Just a quick reminder that the recording is going to be available on our Facebook page right after we end the webinar, but also we're going to upload it to YouTube channel of AUC Press. And you can get your copy from major bookstores and online book retailers worldwide. And we have a special discount of 10% ongoing till the 20th of March. If you use a discount code through the links that I pasted on the chat, and also you're gonna get them through the follow-up email on your email addresses that you registered with. So you can enjoy it, a special 10% discount. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, our guests and our panelists. It was my pleasure to host you today. And yeah, I'm sure we're gonna have more future discussions and maybe more books about women in ancient Egypt. It definitely deserves so.
Thank you all, and thank you, Suzanne, for arranging this, and for everyone for making the time in the day to be with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye. Also, hello to some other contributors, and I'll see you in the audience.
Thank you. Bye.